Senator Paterson, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me, Mark.
So this concept that you've brought up, I read your op-ed piece in the Australian Financial Review, and the idea of creating a common market amongst what were essentially the core countries of the Commonwealth, Australia, United Kingdom, New Zealand, and Canada. What would be the advantage of that?
Well, CANZUK is not a new idea, and I can't take credit for it, but I'm proposing a new approach, which is to build on the existing free trade agreement that Australia has with New Zealand and include Canada and the UK in it. The strength of this approach is that the arrangement between Australia and New Zealand has worked fantastically well for both countries. We're both more prosperous, we're both more free, and we're both closer from this experience, and I think Canada and the United Kingdom would fit in really well in that alliance.
So what would actually change? I think a lot of Canadians, myself included, if I thought about it, probably would assume that we already have pretty free trade between, former Commonwealth nations. But I know that's not really the case. What would we notice that changes?
Well, number one, any remaining tariffs would go. And you're right that generally countries like Australia and Canada are open to free trade, but because we don't have an existing free trade agreement, there are still some barriers to trade between Australia and Canada. And there's obviously even more significant barriers between both of our countries and the United Kingdom because they've been in the European Union and not able to negotiate their own trade policy or their own trade agreements. So probably the biggest benefits for all of our countries would come in reaching an agreement with the UK. But there'll be some additional benefits by grouping together as a block of very like-minded countries with very similar legal systems, similar democratic systems, similar values, and obviously common language.
Now, this idea appeals to me because of what I hope might be included would be things like labor mobility. I think it'd be wonderful to go down and work in Australia for a while and then ultimately come back here. Is that something that you would see being part of this agreement?
Absolutely. That's a core part of the existing arrangement between Australia and New Zealand. We have what basically we call visa-free travel. So New Zealanders and Australians can visit each other's countries for tourism, for study and for business with virtually no restrictions at all. Obviously, we retain some controls for national security reasons and health vetting and things like that, but they're very basic. And pretty much every citizen can freely travel in each other's countries, and there's huge economic as well as cultural benefits from that.
Now, Canada is, always looking for free trade agreements to, new markets to sell goods and to a lesser extent, but growing in importance, services. Australia is so far away. Logistically, the cost of getting goods to and from Australia must be the, prohibitive factor, more so, I would think, than tariffs and duties and regulations. Would there be much increase in goods trade between the two countries, do you think?
Well, transport costs are actually not the biggest part of trade barriers between most countries, even for Australia, which is, as you say, a long way away. We trade all over the world, including the UK, which is at least as far away from Australia as Canada is, and that's no barrier for us, and we think there's capacity to increase it significantly. The interesting thing about Australia and Canada's economies is that they're quite similar. We both have a heavy emphasis on natural resources and we both have a heavy emphasis on agriculture. But Australia and New Zealand are like that as well. We have very similar overlapping areas of our economies, and we've been able to trade really happily and successfully even with that.
One of the big areas where Canada always gets into trouble with trading partners are things like supply management in the dairy industry and softwood lumber, the way that we manage the fact that a lot of the trees that we cut and sell to the U.S. come off of Crown lands. Would those be sticking points, do you think?
All countries have their own intricacies and differences within their trade systems and their policy framework, and that's something that we've proven, and I know you've proven, that can be overcome to strike really good trade agreements. As a matter of principle, I think we should start from the basis that there be no barriers at all between trade between our two countries, and if there are some areas that are special cases that need to be carved out from that, then they can be added on. But we shouldn't start from the opposite point of view, which is with all the barriers that we have now and choose which ones to get rid of. I think we should get rid of all of them and then rebuild any that are necessary after that.
Now, speaking of sooner rather than later, how long let's assume that everybody thinks this is a great idea, and I kind of like the idea. So there's one vote for you right there from somebody who doesn't matter at all. But how long would it take to negotiate a deal like this? Some of these free trade agreements take decades.
All multilateral trade agreements have their complexities and take time, but of any of them, this would be one of the most simple to negotiate. It wouldn't be anywhere near as complex as I know your recent trade agreement with the European Union has been, and we're about to go through the same process, and it certainly wouldn't be as complex as the TPP. And the reason for that is that there's so much in common with each of our countries, and each of our countries have great histories of being free trading nations and nations who can negotiate free trade agreements, with the exception of the UK, who's been inside the EU, and that's prevented them from striking their own free trade agreements. But I know already that Australia and New Zealand have loaned to the United Kingdom trade negotiators to help them in striking their deals once they leave the EU.
Is the government in Australia going to actually move in this direction, do you think?
Well, I hope so, and I'm advocating that they do. And when I wrote my article in the Financial Review in Australia this week, I got a lot of encouraging messages of support from my colleagues. So it's not official Australian government policy today, but I hope over time it will gain popularity and will be adopted as government policy.
Senator James Paterson, thank you very much for taking the time to explain to us what was on your mind.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you.